Hello friends, painting enthusiasts, and welcome to a new video. Today we are going to turn a simple blank canvas into something vibrant, warm, and something that really just feels like summer. Now I'm going to be using a smaller canvas. That's just so I can finish in 1 or 2 days. However, you are more than welcome to use something significantly larger. Now we're going to try something a little different this week. I don't typically tone my canvas. However, I think we're going to do so with some burnt sienna. It's a rather simple process. Step 1, we get a little bit of water. Step 2, we add paint to the palette. Step 3, we're going to grab our 1-inch flat-headed brush and we'll proceed to make it incredibly wet. From there, we'll grab a little bit of that burnt sienna, mix them together to the point where it's almost like a watercolor, and this will be perfect for giving a light toning of the canvas. So here, as you can see, we'll head in and I'll just start working in an X-shaped pattern. This is going to help me move paint not only up and down, not only left and right, but just about everywhere. Also, if you listen nice and close, create some great ASMR. This is just going to give us a nice warm base that makes the rest of our colors nice and cohesive. Once our canvas is fully dry to the touch, we are going to grab it and go to a sketch. I always like to open my reference photo in Photoshop and create a little grid. This just helps me work with the rule of thirds and make sure that it's a strong composition. From there, we're going to start sketching, and I like to use these woodless colored pencils because they allow me to allocate different colors to different subjects. Just keep it simple. Speaking of keeping it simple, if you're looking at the drawing and you're thinking it's not as beginner friendly as you'd like it to be, I do have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you can get this copied to your canvas nice and easy. Also, if you are up over on Patreon, you can get ad-free access to these videos. So if you're watching these with ads, you don't have to be. And up there you can also get all of my ebooks, which includes acrylics for beginners, as well as over 100 bonus lessons. There's a link in the description. But with that, I am almost done the sketch, so we're gonna head over to the canvas and get painting. I typically like a fairly wide palette for my sunsets, so we'll grab quite a few here. Let's start with titanium white, cadmium yellow, Naples yellow, more burnt sienna, cadmium red, cerulean blue, and last but not least, Mars black. Yet again, we'll grab our 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll also make the brush just a little bit damp to help keep our paint wet longer, and it'll also help with the blending process. Now for our first mix, we're going to grab an abundance of titanium white, just a little bit of our cad yellow, our Naples yellow, and we'll take that mix, place it right over where our eventual sun will be. From there, we'll head back to our palette, double down on our cad yellow, and add some burnt sienna. This will make it nice and warm. We'll apply that right around our sun to be, and we'll head back to the palette yet again. Now we'll grab some cad red. We'll make it more of an orangey hue, and we'll head back to the canvas. Apply that yet again right around our previous mix, though we'll start blending them by softly working one into the other. Now we'll start working that sky outwards, and I'm going to avoid a lot of my drawn in clouds. I'll paint around the edges of them, but we'll head back later to actually insert them. I'll also apply just a little bit of this over and inside my tree line. That way we can paint our trees on top of it and have some of their light poking through. Now we're going back in with a little bit of yellow, just building that up. You're going to want to do a lot of layering because we are working with acrylics and they are innately fairly thin. just using the corner of the brush to get a nice sharp edge. Very versatile brush when you use it correctly. Now we'll change our colors with an abundance of our cerulean blue, a little bit of our titanium white, hint of our Mars black. I'm just using the corner of my brush, and we'll start mixing up a fairly bright but grayed cerulean. Now ideally, while the pinkish orange is still wet, we're going to apply this right above it. But I'm not actually letting them touch just yet. I want to apply a good amount of this blue atop that area. That way, if I start here, I don't muddy the pigments over here. I'm not dragging orange up into areas that should be blue. So we're going to get the majority of our pigment off of our brush. We can do a couple little taps into where our foliage will be. And then I'll start dragging that down into the pre-existing orange. Yet again, working the brush very softly as to not create hard lines. And when you initially start, it will look a little bit awkward, but we can head back to our palette, grab more of that orange, apply that towards the bottom, and move that up into our blue. So we end up with this slightly green, bluish mixture, which actually looks really beautifully natural in sunsets. Now, admittedly, this blue is a little bit too saturated, so we're going to grab some extra titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, work that into our blue mixture, and as you can see, it's still a relatively bright blue, but it's more gray than it was. So, we'll apply this towards the top. We'll continue working it upwards, still working in an X-shaped pattern, softly to move that pigment up, and as we continue to move up, we are going to get more blue and more dark. So interjecting more of that cerulean blue, more of that Mars black, still using some of our titanium white because we do want that to really desaturate the larger mix. But once I have an abundance of it, we'll head back up here. We have a big cloud in this area, so I'm not going to do too much in that space, but I'll get my pigment off. And we'll start blending that with our previous blue. So we have this really nice elongated gradient of colors. We can also grab more of that bright blue if it starts to dry. We can go back and forth between the darker and the brighter until we get what we really want, because again, they are acrylics, they are innately fairly thin, and the more layers we do, long term, the better our painting's going to look. That said, let's work our way up to the top, and then we can start working on some of our clouds. So far, I really like it. Now I'm just going in with a second layer over all of it to keep it thick and cohesive. And once it's dry to the touch, we can grab some Conte and get sketching. I typically like Conte because it's something I can wash off of a canvas fairly easily, as well as allocate different colors to different subjects, much like the woodless colored pencils. Now, as a friendly reminder, while I am freehand sketching this back in, if you are subscribed up over on the Patreon, you can download the traceable, so you know exactly where these clouds should be. I'm being a little loose with it because I can just wash it off if I don't like it, but really love woodless colored pencils for my initial sketch, and Conte over acrylic paint. Just works really nicely. From there, we are going to pick our larger flat-headed brush back up and head in the clouds. Now we're essentially going to work on 3 areas of clouds, starting at the bottom, and we'll work our way up. So we're going to mix 2 pigments for our clouds here. The first is going to be our highlight. It's equal parts titanium white, Naples yellow, a hint of our cad yellow, a hint of our cad red, and that's looking great. Now we'll grab our liner brush and make sure it's nice and damp. As for our application, I'm going to paint this predominantly towards the bottoms of our clouds, and we will have a little bit of it on the top of the cloud as well, but that application is going to be a lot thinner. So we will continuously go back down, build up that bottom, and that's because these clouds as a whole are backlit. We have the light coming from behind them. It's wrapping around the bottom, illuminating that area, and the top is a little bit illuminated with the main body of it a bit darker. So we'll use a different pigment for that. So here you can see just how sharp we can get these applications if we don't apply much pressure. The more we apply, the thicker the application will be because we expand the bristles. It's also pretty imperative to have lots of unique markings in this. So don't try to make all of the clouds soft or sharp. I'm going in with a lot of tapping. Here we have some little areas that protrude out and kind of get lost in the sky. We can wait till we almost start running out of pigment to make them look nice and airy, semi-transparent. We can also use more water to do that. But we want typically the middle of our clouds to be a bit more opaque, and then the edges to be a bit softer, especially for the ones that are smaller and work their way out. Also worth noting that I'm only going to work on these clouds to begin with, and then I will work on the one towards the top a little bit later. And that's just so that I don't overcommit. Now we are focusing on the sky. If you're wondering about the reflection, don't worry about that. We are going to do that a little bit later. Reflections are innately a bit darker than that which they're reflecting, so we'd use a slightly different palette and different mixes. But we will get there. Now towards this bottom cloud right here, we want a lot of light on the right-hand side of it because it's next to the sun. So we're going to apply that there, and then we'll let it dissipate as we work towards the left-hand side. And when it protrudes out, area like this that would catch a lot of sun, we do some extra strokes, a little bit more pressure to expand it, and then we have a little bit under here that I'm only going to work on once I've started to really run out of pigment, because this is just going to be lines of clouds in the background. They're a little bit hazy. They're not as opaque or as bright as that. And if these markings end up being brighter than your sun, don't worry, we can go back to this, add some extra titanium white, and brighten it up. Really easy with the liner brush because it's great for the detail work. I don't typically do voiceovers on this channel. However, there is going to be quite a bit of repetition in such grand clouds. So we'll just speed this up and let you see exactly what I'm doing. Now we're going to mix the darker color for the cloud, and we're starting with some cerulean blue, good amount of Mars black, titanium white. We want a much more grayed blue than we've used previously, and we want it to be slightly darker than that which we used previously at the top of the canvas. I'm also going to interject just a hint of warmth using my burnt sienna, and this should be a great start for our clouds. Now we'll grab said newly mixed pigment, and we'll just start working that into our opening for our cloud. As you can see, this is much more gray than our previous mixture. I'm not going to overlap it with the highlight, but I will bring it right next to it, and then I'll head back to my palette. From there, I'm just interjecting a little bit of extra Mars black and cerulean blue for a slightly darker mix and a soon-to-be gradient. This darker, more blue mix is going to go on the top and in the central areas of our cloud. Then I'll start blending it down into the brighter, more airy areas. It's also worth noting that I'm using a very soft application style here, and that's just so that I don't get any hard brush strokes. Everything blends much more softly. And yet again, we're back to the liner brush. While that's all still wet, we are going to apply that same bright highlight to the bottom, and we can just work that in and up. If you find it gets a little bit too green, we can re-interject Cad Red into this mix. It'll make it pink on the palette, but it'll blend better into the blue. And it's all about finding that right balance between the yellows, the pinks, and the blues. We can also go back to the highlighted blues and blend those. So we're jumping between 3 or 4 mixes, colors right now. And it just keeps it versatile and fun. Using the liner brush, I'm working in a rounded shape to create softer transitions. But now it doesn't look like we have a hard outline. It looks like it starts to blend into the edge, into the cloud. It's a much more cohesive subject. We don't want too dramatic of a blend inwards, but we do want a little bit. Now we're going in for layer number 2, where I'm just brightening that edge, making a bit more Naples yellow heavy, a bit more titanium white heavy. You can see it's desaturating the pinks and the orange hues that we had in there. And that's really just part of that elongated process of making this exactly what we want it to be. A little bit of a wash here. Don't have much actual pigment on my brush, a lot of water, a hint of pigment. I'm just pressing the side of the brush into the canvas in a circular motion until this warmth and this light works its way up. There we go. You can have a roll along the edges too. Now, because we added that little wash, everything's pretty reflective and it can be difficult to see the innate colors and values, but as it dries, it will be more easily distinguishable. Though, by making it all wet with that little bit of a wash, I can now go in and do these additional little clouds and markings, these areas that protrude out of the bottom of the cloud and catch light. So it allows us to paint much more softly again, very much wet on wet, and create some additional forms. Trying to make the bottoms of these markings sharp, and then they soften as we work upwards. So you work those round little motions up, but you keep the bottom clean. There we go. Now, I often get asked the question, how do I keep my paint wet on the palette for so long? And the answer is, I don't really. I have to remix it, and that's just what we're doing here. So from there, we are going to head back in, do a bit more volumizing in the clouds, finding different areas which could extend, could protrude, could catch more light, moving those highlights up. We can even use our fingers here and there to build that volume, get something that's a bit more subtle. Though if you do use your fingers, make sure that they are well washed. You use soap because you don't want the oils from your finger getting onto the canvas and making it so there are areas that just won't adopt paint. As long as they're cleanly, should be fine. Also, we're never too old to finger paint. So, as an update, I am looking at my reference photo, and I noticed 2 things. 1, the top has too much light, and 2, the miniature clouds which protrude need a little bit more diversity in size. So, these applications are going to start in the middle of my previous clouds. I'm thickening the body, leaving the edges a bit more semi-transparent, and then when I have very little pigment on my brush, I'll create new areas for clouds to protrude. And because this is so watery, it'll look nice and wispy, a bit more airy and flowy. And you can see that I'm also doing lots of little taps this time. So it's just the end of the liner brush, creating a soft impression and rendering something nice. And again, I think airy is a great word for it. Some of them are almost not visible, and we layer those not visible ones behind the ones which are. Here, just a couple more along the edge. Keep the flow of the cloud moving this way. And I love it. From there, we're going back to our larger flat-headed brush. We're going to correct some, not mistakes, but areas that could be a little bit better. Now, for our fix of the clouds, making them a little bit darker, we are just going to create a darker rendering of that pigment that we used before. So a lot of Mars black, Cerulean blue, and titanium white. And we'll switch to our filbert brush. This is great because it has round edges. Fantastic brush for soft applications, and that's exactly what we need right now. When looking at the photo, I realized this area right here at the top didn't actually have a highlight. I think the cloud is just too large to have the light wrap around it in such a way. So I'm just going to go back up, re-interject some of this darker value. Here I'm going to make it a little bit spotty, that way it can protrude down. And then I'll just softly, with a watery version of this brush, doesn't have any additional pigment, I'll just do a bit of a soft blend, very little pressure. At this point we're used to soft applications. It should work fairly well. So I love this cloud and I think it's great. It also taught us a lot about how we're going to do these clouds right here, which is our next step. Now, because we're moving down and closer to the sun, I do want a slightly brighter variant of that dark blue cloud mixture, so we'll interject some titanium white. Now, I'm going to start with this mixture towards the top of my cloud, and then I'll slowly work our way down, as we noted with the first larger one. I'm not overlapping any of the edges, I'm just working on the insides. We'll continue. As we do, we'll run out of pigment. This will get brighter, and that makes sense because we are moving into brighter clouds towards the sun. Now, admittedly, as you can see, I continued painting the clouds until I realized I didn't love them. So I decided to cover them up with the highlight that I was working with, and from there, we'll simply do them again. Hopefully, this just acts as a reminder that even when you do paint professionally, there are going to be areas that you don't love, and that's okay. We cover it up, we learn along the way, and we turn into something we love. So be patient and keep painting. So jumping back into this, I let everything fully dry, and I'm going to make more of a white heavy, yellow, orange heavy mix, less pink, I think, towards the bottom. I was going more of like a purplish pink route, and the more I did, the more I realized I wanted orange and I wanted white. So we did that. We're grabbing our liner, and I'm going to brighten up the bases yet again. We still want that to be bright. We just want it to be more of an orangey white bright, especially towards the sun. Now from there, we're going to make this mix a little bit darker with a hint of our Mars black, more of our cerulean blue, and we'll apply that on top of our clouds. Also, for the first time this painting, I'm switching to a smaller flat-headed brush. Great for detail work, but also getting sharp lines. So we'll begin with some of our darker blue towards the top of these clouds, and then I'll move more into the brighter variant as we start to move down. I'm leaving a little bit of that edge because, again, we want that highlight wrapping around at the top, not only the bottom. And we'll move to the truly warm area as we continue to dive down. Now we'll grab more of our highlight. And I'll do a nice soft blend into our blue. We'll let that carry up pretty dramatically to the point where there isn't any just blue left. It's all a gradient. Now, if your blues are a little bit too cool, we're going to grab some Cad Red, some of our burnt sienna, mix that into our highlight till we get more of a warm orangey hue, and we can wash that on top. Now with this, as you can see, we have an opportunity to go over that blue very softly and have a little bit more water, admittedly. So the blue's still showing through. We still have this gradient, but it's softer, it's warmer, it's more cohesive with the rest of the painting. This is a process which, if you're being quite detailed with it, can take 45 minutes, an hour, maybe plus. So I thought I would just let you see this process in a time-lapse form because you did just see it in the larger cloud, and I want you to see all of it, but I also didn't want it to get too repetitive. So as per usual, we have our larger highlights on the bottom of our clouds, a slight highlight on the top, a bluish yet orange hue as we progressively work down in the middle, in between those two highlights, and we're softening it more and more as we get towards the bottom. So we're back. I'm actually really happy with how this is turning out, but there are a couple details that are yet to be implemented. We're going to add a glow around the sun. We're going to add some wispy transparent clouds to complement the ones in which we already have. And we're going to do that in real time right now. We're going to start with the sun and our filbert brush because we need that round edge for our soft wet and dry blends. As for our palette, we'll grab a good amount of titanium white, a little bit of Naples yellow, hint of our burnt sienna, and we'll head into the canvas. We'll start around the sun, as you can see, and I'm just going to slowly move my brush using the corner of it outwards until we get this softer, rounded blend. And the more water you use, the easier it'll be. We'll also expand it out over our clouds. We'll just let that dissipate. Beautiful. Now we'll switch to our liner brush. We'll make a mix a little bit more warm and Naples yellow heavy. And we'll go in for some nice wispy clouds. These are very watered down. There's a lot of line work to them, but we're kind of following this general movement this way. And I will also use my fingers to make it more transparent. It's a lot of line work, it's a lot of pushing this way for the sake of leading lines and moving the viewer with the canvas. We'll do some throughout here, just little ones. But this creates multiple layers and levels to our clouds, which do a really great job of creating additional distance and scale. We can do it all throughout. Now with that same pigment, I'm just going to head right under my previous larger cloud because there's some pretty hard strokes at the bottom. And I'm going to soften it by giving it a light glow. So very watery application, which then dissipates as we move downwards. I'll go back, I'll grab a little bit more, I'll reapply. And the idea is we make it more opaque along the edge. And we have it lessen as we move down, and it will naturally do that as we run out of paint. Might take a couple layers, but That's okay. We're patient. Once we have our cloud done, we're going to head right down here, start working on that back tree line, and interject a new color. Our green of choice for this painting will be sap green because it's fairly neutral. For this next mix, it'll be fairly silhouetted, so we'll start with Mars Black. We'll grab some of that nice green, hint of titanium white, and a little bit of our burnt sienna for warmth as well. The actual application process is pretty easy. We essentially have a hill, which I'll just paint in like so. We have a horizon against the lake. We'll fill it in between, and then we'll add some detail. So now I'm going in with the liner brush, and I'm just tapping the tops of trees, small protrusions which stick out to varying degrees. And I think it's important to note that initially when we drew this, we kind of had this fairly simple line. But here we want some areas to protrude up, and then it goes back down, and then maybe it goes back up again. It's that variance which will make this feel much more realistic in the end, despite the fact that it's such a simple silhouetted subject. So that's looking good. Great little entry into our greens, but it's time for a much bigger subject. Now we want something a little bit brighter than this, so we'll grab our sap green, good amount of our Mars Black, but not as much, titanium white, and this time we are going to avoid adding any burnt sienna or additional hues. We just want a mid to dark valued green, something we can make brighter or darker. Now this is incredibly cathartic in that we are covering a grand amount of what would have been white canvas. We did the orange backing, and that is showing through on the green right now, but at this point we are committing to putting our mid value down. We're going to apply darker values over this, we're going to apply lighter values over this. I'm going to work around some of the speckled sky which I painted earlier. If you don't have any or much, that's okay, because we will go in and paint more. But right now our goal is to cover all of the greenery in the midground. So that does work its way up over the clouds. It does go on with a larger flat-headed brush because this can just move so much paint so quickly. It's unbelievably convenient. And we'll grab a bit of water, grab a bit of paint, and we'll head down to this area. Now we'll work this into this little protruding landmass, and we'll bring it right back to that central spot. Fill that in. Right underneath we're just going to have reflections and water. A lot of fun subjects. But for now, we have a big green base. Now we'll take our liner brush, we'll head into the tops of these trees. I'll make the very top as small as we can, and then I'll apply a little bit of pressure to extend the line, make it wider as we get towards the bottom. We're going to do a couple of these trees. As you can see, they're not straight lines. We don't want them to be, because they need more diversity than that. Then with that same liner brush, we're going to go to the top, and we'll start tapping on branches, protrusions, and I think a lot of people initially paint and draw branches via lines. We're not doing that. We are doing that via taps. We're almost doing it like pointillism, in that it's just this larger collection of smaller markings which, when taken a step back, when amalgamated, render something larger and cohesive, some greater form. And that form here is branches, it's foliage. You also notice that a lot of these branches are moving upwards. That's because branches innately do, once they get too much weight, they start to level out, become flat, and we can have that happen here a little bit, and then they drape down towards the bottom, but we don't have any trees that are visibly notable towards the bottom, so we don't have to think about that right now. Right now, a lot of our branches are just moving up and to the sides. Now we're going to head over to this tree to the left of that first one. And again, we start at the top with these little taps. Nice and easy. It's pretty intuitive. Try not to make your branches protrude in the same areas on the left and right hand side. You want to do a large one here, and then we take a break on the other side. Then we come down a little bit, and then we can do more. And that's just going to make it look a lot more natural. Typically, we try to take the symmetry out of our trees. I know when we're growing up and we're looking at different books and cartoons, we see a lot of symmetry, but that's kind of what gives it that cartoony effect. When you want it to be real, you look for ways of making it unique, taking out symmetry and diversifying. We're also going to overlap branches from this tree and this tree. Might look a little messy, but that's okay. That's also natural. Now we'll take a break from our tall trees and we'll do more of a bush-like aesthetic, or at least a tree which has a bit more of a rounded form. So for this, I'm doing that pointillism-like application, working my way down with this rounded edge. It gets more dense towards the bottom, so we have more openings towards the top. We're overlapping into these trees, and we're doing that yet again over here. So we're really diversifying our types of trees, our clusters of foliage. We're overlapping various applications for the sake of diversity, but also creating depth. And then once we have our break, we can go back over into the tall trees. And much like the others, I'm using as little pressure as possible towards the top here. When I get to the bottom branches, I can apply a little bit more pressure, but I don't usually opt to. I just do more of those taps in that area to expand that tree. These taps are so subtle you don't even hear them. There we go. And this area around the sun, that's where we have to be truly careful. Now we are going to have a more rounded tree down here. This is really going to stand out as a light backdrop of the sun. So we are being intentional, we are taking our time, we are being mindful. Like that, grabbing some extra paint. Want it to be darker towards this larger edge, and it can get brighter as we move out. We can continue this tree downwards as well. And we can re-interject a light if we cover up too much, but I think we'll be okay. Now, this area here is clusters of larger leaves we can actually see and distinguish from clusters. So I'm going in with that same liner brush, however I have more paint on it and I'm pressing a little bit harder with my brush. The goal here is to have openings so we can see the clouds through portions of our foliage and do so in unique and original ways. So here we have a couple little ones that are sticking out much farther. Here maybe we do ones that are much farther. We have some that are overlapping. And it really cleans up the edges, makes it look a lot more professional. But we'll double down on this when we work in our highlights fairly soon. Like that line. Once our base layer is dry, we're going to pick up our Conte and head back and do a little sketch. Now, throughout that process, we did lose this foreground tree and its dimensions. So I'm just looking at the traceable I had sketched out and re-sketching it, trying to instill a good amount of diversity within the protrusions. We can incorporate some openings, but we'll also, again, head back up here because there are a series of trees and bushes, which also add a good amount of depth and shouldn't be forgotten. So we'll work that down here, create a couple lines for when these trees and bushes meet the tall grass, and we'll also sketch out the side of the tall grass, the way it works its way back, and its secondary edge. Now we'll render an even darker green than that which we just had. This will be for our proper shadows, and we do need an abundance, though I am going to spread it fairly wide here on my palette. Now for the first time today, we're going to grab a fan brush. As you can see, it has a myriad of various bristles. All of these will render a unique marking, and it's great for instilling a lot of detail very quickly. We'll grab just a little bit of that pigment with our brush, and I'm going to apply it in the background via a vertical tap along the tops of our trees, just as an easy starting point. And then we're going to allow it to filter out into the larger open mass of foliage. And with this, I'm going to keep a lot of the markings somewhat vertical, but I'm also interjecting these diagonal crisscrossing applications. This is all going to instill a lot of shadow, areas of the foliage which cannot receive light, and a lot of detail for our painting as well. It's important that while we are rotating our brush, we are always doing so in the air and not on the canvas, because if we do so on the canvas, we end up rendering streaks, and that's not what we're looking for. It's also worth noting that we are using a stiff bristled fan brush, so when we add pigment, the bristles stay farther apart. If you're using a soft bristled fan brush, they'll probably condense and you'll render a larger marking than what you want. So stay with a stiff one for this part of the painting. A little bit later, we will switch to a softer bristled fan brush. Now, as we move forward and approach these bushes, rather than going in initially with a vertical tap, I'm going in with a tap which is much more on the angle of the bush itself. So if there is line work rendered through these taps, in the very least, it continues the larger motions of the subject. Here again, you can see it's on that angle, but I'm also rounding it, so it mirrors the larger movements of the eventual curve as well. Then we can throw in some horizontal markings and some vertical ones just to render inconsistency and ensure that it looks nice and natural. It's also worth noting that we're going to do more taps towards the bottom of our subjects rather than the top, because there will be more shadows towards the bottom of our subjects than there will be towards the top. Subjects render shadows on themselves, and the light will just have a harder time getting towards that bottom portion as well. So with that, I think it's looking pretty good. And from there, we'll grab more pigment and start heading into this tall grass. For that, I'm just doing a little bit of a tap and a drag down. I'm also moving with an entirely horizontal brush. That way, all of these markings look like they are uniform with the way the grass protrudes upwards. We'll start to press on forward. As we get closer to us, our markings can get a little bit bigger, so I'm doing slightly more of a drag downwards, though it still isn't dramatic. And from there, we'll grab more of that pigment, and we will do some dramatic pulls, just like this, to show the sides of the grass. And as we move closer and closer to the foreground, you can see just how these elongate, how this separates all of that greenery, and we get that stark impression. Slightly more markings towards the bottom still, and That's looking quite great. Taps on the top with a minor drag, long drags on the bottom, rather on the side of the grass. So now, for the first time with this brush, we will add some water, and this is going to, as you see, condense a lot of our bristles to the point where it forks the brush. So now rather than making 20 impressions, we make 5, maybe 6. Great for adding larger details, but still a good number of them. Now, as we approach our foreground subject, which is this larger tree, we can tap on the shadows for individual openings in leaves. So these markings are much larger than that of which we've previously rendered, and we're going to do more of them towards the right-hand side of the subject. This is because we are moving farther and farther away from the light as we wrap towards that left-hand side, though we still will have a fair number on the edge, just as so. It's also worth noting that we are using the same brush. Talked about how you could use a soft bristled fan brush for this and a hard bristled otherwise. This is a brush from my brush set, and we designed it so that when it's dry it acts as a hard bristled fan brush. When it's wet it acts as a soft bristled fan brush, and it gets both jobs done quite effectively. That way you don't have to switch. I use my brush set for all of my lessons here on the channel, and if you'd like to work with the exact same tools and brushes, there will be a link to it in the video description. That said, I think this is fairly well applied, and we are going to wait for it to dry. So 5-10 minute break, and then we'll head back in with some highlights. For our next mix, we're going to start working on a highlight. However, we're going to do quite a number of them, so our first highlight needs to be relatively muted and still incorporate a good amount of Mars Black in the mix. Now we're back to using a dry fan brush for this because I really want sharp applications, and a lot of them. These highlights are going to layer on top of our shadows, on top of our mid value. We can continue our larger trees downwards, so I'm working in this fairly vertical application to begin with, but there are also these rounded trees which work both in front of and behind our taller ones, so those are also being interjected. Additionally, more light is being applied right along this edge here, which is close to the sun, because it will simply receive more light. Then we have it dissipate as we move towards the right and back. Now for the next highlight and layer, we're going to go with additional titanium white, sap green, and just brighten it up a little bit. So here we go in yet again, aiming to apply these brighter, more dominant highlights, predominantly on the left-hand side of my trees initially, because that is the side that is facing the light, but then we will start working it inwards, both in the shape of the trees towards the bottom, but also in a randomized fashion. It's important to have a little bit of both to imply structure, but also to break it and keep things innately organic. Losing pigment as we run towards the right hand side, and that's also good because we want it to be dissipating and getting darker. And as we move towards the right hand side in the center, we do come across these nice big bushes, trees, pieces of greenery. And I'm going to apply these highlighted taps along the edges of them first for the sake of defining them and their space. We're not outlining it, but we are essentially creating an outline via, again, this pointillistic application. And then from there we can start bringing it downwards towards the right, letting that paint dissipate, having those more transparent applications as they get lost within the shadows of themselves. Now, before we switch our mix, we're going to do 2 other areas. The first, with that same dry brush, is going to be in the grass down here. And I'm just doing a tap with a horizontal position of the brush on top of all of this. So nice and easy. It's far away. We're not going to see the details, but we will see a slight highlight on the top of these blades. That said, as we move towards the right-hand side, we start to lose that highlight because this is creating a shadow on this area. So we let it just naturally dissipate, and then we work on the front area here, which, because it protrudes even more, it can catch a bit of light. So it goes from light to dark to light here. You see I really double down on that. And then it dissipates again as you move towards the right and towards the top back area. Now, from there, just going to be fairly cautious, but incorporate a couple markings downwards. These are longer drags for the front of the grass here that we see. We don't want it to have a lot of light because it's opposite to the side of the light, but we do need some movements and highlight. And for cohesion's sake, we're going to take some of these highlights and just little taps and little drags towards the back and the sun, starting right next to it. And then as we move towards the left-hand side, we let that paint run out and dissipate, though I am going to bring it all the way to the edge for the sake of implying the same visual texture throughout the entirety of it. There we go. Now, as you can see, my palette has started to dry, so we'll just mix up a bit more of that same pigment and continue onward. From there, I did make my brush nice and damp, so it forked well, and now we can apply highlight to these larger leaves that we have towards the right-hand side of the canvas. We're going in with a bit more of a sizable tap, so there's more pressure being applied. That's expanding the bristles on impact, creating something nice and big, something that stands out from the other applications, because we are using the same values and the same hues, though we are getting something that looks distinctly different. And application is so important for that. So we'll just continue working this out, letting it run out as we move towards the right with the occasional little highlighted speckle, and put that towards the bottom. Now, I think it's time for something a little bit brighter. Now we'll build an even brighter highlight with Naples yellow, more sap green, and for warmth, a hint of our burnt sienna. Now we'll go in with that highlight, initially, of course, right beside our light, and to the left of our trees with the occasional area that protrudes and catches more light. Then we can work it into the other highlights which already exist in our foliage. And this is really just a case of finding the areas that really deserve that light and doubling down. We've already established where the light is. Now we are reinforcing it through additional application. This is warmer, will be more cohesive, and we can even apply it to the back where we have our sun, and in a similar application style to this grass right here. So we're going in with the taps, all of which are horizontal, all of which are now a lot brighter. And we just let that run out as we move towards the right hand side. But we do have this nice gradient from light to dark. We'll grab a bit more pigment. Do the same over here. Beautiful. Well done. And from there, we'll just do one more round of highlights using that Naples yellow, burnt sienna, sap green, and we do have some Mars black and titanium white in there from the previous mixtures. Now I'm going to do these highlights with a different brush, that being the liner. I'm going to head into the previous highlights and just tap on a little bit of this warmth to the left hand side of them, the side that's facing the sun and the light. We can interject new markings, but for the most part we are looking for the pre-established ones that could just be a little bit brighter and making those pop to a greater degree. Liner brush is great because it does allow us to allocate this very intentional detail. The fan brush is fantastic for a lot of detail very quickly. This one, intentional detail. It takes a bit longer, but I really like the results, and I think the combination of the two is how we really render the magic. So we'll apply this predominantly towards the top, little bits towards the middle and the bottom, though admittedly not as much because we do just get more shadows the farther down we get. So jumping back into this, we are going to work on mirroring that color in the sky with our Naples yellow, little bit of our titanium white, hint of our cad red, and we'll also grab just a hint of our burnt sienna. The goal here is to render something nice and warm, but also a good complex warmth. Now, the actual pigment here on the canvas probably going to look a little bit darker than what we have in the sky, and that actually is intentional. Reflections are innately just a little bit darker than that which they are reflecting. As we continue to move down, we're going to continue to interject more burnt sienna, more cad red, and make it, again, just a bit darker, a little bit warmer, move away from those yellows into the oranges, because it really is just the opposite of what we did on the top. Then we're going to make it a bit gray. So hint of Mars black, about 3-4 times that titanium white, a little bit of that burnt sienna, and this will render a fairly desaturated warm hue. Something that'll act as a fantastic transition between the yellows and oranges into the blues. And we are jumping back into the blues. We have our cerulean blue, which is of course a little too saturated for this area, so we add in some Mars black, some titanium white, make sure we have a good smooth mix there, and we'll apply that right under it. I'm trying to do all of this fairly quickly, that way we can paint wet into wet. It'll just make the process a little bit easier, it'll make the blends a little bit smoother, and as I do this, I try to cut around the boat fairly sharply, but if I do lose that drawing, that is okay. I don't mind sketching it back in with some Conte, and you can always use the traceable up over on Patreon. That said, now that we have a good amount of paint on the canvas, I'm going to go back in and very smoothly work my brush over it. If we apply a lot of pressure, we will create strokes and streaks, and we don't really want that, so I'm trying to be very gentle through this process, and the water on the brush is helping me do so. It's a fairly thick application. You can't really see the orange of the canvas showing through in this portion anymore, and layering really does help add to the realism in paintings like this. That said, it is time to go a little bit lower. That means going a little bit more saturated, and a little bit darker. As we get closer to us, we get more of the innate color of things, so less of that gray, more of the cerulean blue. Though through this section, I am using a little bit more water on my brush because I am mixing into pigment which is starting to dry. As we went through that softening process, we did let parts of that pigment get a little bit sticky. And the best way to combat that is just through a little bit of additional water. So we're still getting those smooth blends, and once I have that all applied, I'm going to go back in, do a bit more saturation towards the top, and re-interject warmth into those grays. Typically, a burnt sienna is great for this because it's not a thick pigment, but it is very saturated. So when we just want to add a little bit of warm saturation, I prefer that to a cadmium red, which is probably going to be a little bit too dominant. With that, I am grabbing a very dark mixture similar to what we used for the back of the tree line. I'm using the larger flat-headed brush, and I'm just going to work in that tree reflection. It's a little bit darker than the first one. I'm working with a lot of vertical strokes, and this is a very simple application. You've done it once, we're just doing it upside down, and then we're filling in the details of the individual trees with our liner brush, making it nice and sharp, trying to mirror it while also having each of these little movements be fairly unique. And we do want our water here to be pretty glassy. We don't want a lot of movement in it, so the actual reflections are going to mimic that which they are reflecting to a fairly strong extent. So trying to be mindful of what's going on up at the top, and then kind of elaborating in upside down. With that, I do like how it's blending into the oranges on the water. It's one of those things where, because we are still using water, it's smooth enough. And I am going to continue to use that brush here with some Mars Black, Titanium White, Naples Yellow, Sap Green, more Naples Yellow, and we'll use this to work back into the reflection. This will be the highlights in the reflection to mirror the light that's kind of hitting the side of all of those trees up beside the sun. It's not going to be as bright, it's not going to be as vibrant, but it is going to share that same movement, that same texture. That way it does still feel like that top subject. The hues and the values are just a little bit different. Also notably, you can see a little bit of the orange of the canvas showing through. Not something you can see in the reflection, but I did like it in this area because it does give us that warmth in the silhouette, which I think looks quite nice. From there, we are going back to the palette. I'm grabbing some titanium white, I'm grabbing some Naples yellow. We're mixing in a little bit of that burnt sienna, again going for a nice warmer hue. And with this, we're going to create a mist right between our tree line and our reflection. This is going to be done through a tap across the edge. You can see that I'm not making a line, but I'm making multiple taps, and that's just going to give me a little bit of control. It's going to create some subtle, unique separations, which I really like. And then when I get closer to the light yet again in additional applications, I'm going to expand it and just make it a little bit bigger. That said, looking at it, it's definitely too harsh. So I'm going in with a damp liner brush, and I'm just blending out the top and the bottom, especially around the light, trying to make that a bit taller, make it stretch down as well, and then it dissipates as it moves towards the left, and it becomes more of that line that we kind of have pre-established. Also, as we move up and down with it, we make it less and less opaque. The more transparent it is, the more it will look like a mist, but right on that horizon line where the water meets the land, we do want that to be a bit more thick, and it just progressively gets more thin towards the edges. I'm also going to throw a couple of openings into my trees over in the center. That way we can see the mist through them, and it just creates this extra little bit of depth, which I think is quite fun. Though this isn't done typically in one application. We do want to let it dry, go back, add more layers, and even the mist here, you can see I'm being fairly sporadic with it. And once I'm done with that, I'm actually in a really good place with that distance. I let the reflection dry, and now I'm going in and I'm just resketching the clouds with some Conte, though this is one of those things where you want it to look fairly close. If it doesn't look perfect, that's okay, it is water, but we want it to be fairly reflective, and that is what it looks like. Now for our clouds, we are yet again going to begin with something nice and bright for the outside, which contains titanium white, burnt sienna, and Naples yellow. So jumping back into this, I'm going to mirror this little guy right here. Get some of that highlight, we'll blend it inwards, and we're already off to a good start. Then we'll move to this cloud over to the right, grab a bit more water and pigment, make sure that has a prominent highlight on the bottom, but remember the bottom's inversed, so now when we say that, we mean the top. So the top of these is going to have the more thick application, where the bottom is going to be thin. So more pressure towards the top, less towards the bottom. Now I'm going to head back in and double down on my layers. Already you can see that's a lot more opaque as we need it to be, and I'll do a little bit of a blend downwards. This is going to be fun in that it tests if we learned how to paint the clouds correctly the first time. It's one of those things where often we paint and we get to where we want to be, but the question is, can we do it again next time we want to render that subject? And this gives us that opportunity to make sure that we really do understand it and that we reinforce those ideas, so when we do again want to jump back into something similar, we can do a good job. And so far, I think we're doing pretty well. Almost like outlining. You don't really like to outline in paintings, but here it does make sense. So now we'll hop down into this cloud, mirroring that one. It's just, again, very bright towards the top, because that's the area that receives the most sunlight. And we'll just make sure that that line work is nice and clean. In the reflection, again, we can make it perfect, but we don't have to. I'm going to make mine fairly close to imply a little bit of movement in the water, but not too much. And then this area is kind of speckled and works its way up and out. So it is acrylics, it is thin, and it does need multiple layers to really start feeling like a reflection of the subject. And now we're going to move down into this beautiful cloud right here. Has a lot of movements in it, which I think is very fun. All of these protruding sharp pieces we get an opportunity to recreate and play with. Though I am letting it get lost as it reconnects to this cloud right here, because we are getting higher up in the sky, farther down in the water. We're getting farther away from the light, and these highlights are going to start dissipating. So we're not doing as much as we were initially, but we are still doing a little bit of a blend up and back, giving it that proper feel. It's just getting a bit more visually ambiguous, which again I like. Now let's do some taps. There we go. And we have some wispy motions that come through there. We have a good wispy motion that goes through here. As we start to really render that form, we can be more playful, just like we were at the top. From there, we'll just go ahead, move right down to the reflection of what will be our largest cloud. And we really don't see much of it. So it's essentially a line. We do a little bit of a blend upwards just for the sake of a blooming, diffused look, but the majority of it is a blend downwards where we just slowly run out of paint and cover what was a dark blue with what is now a more muted, less dark blue. Now we'll take a look at the sun, head down, and render what that would be. We're going to cover all of this up with a reflection of that, but I want to put this here so that I know how to expand the highlight that comes from the sun, that warmth, that brightness, and we'll just work that out with a circular motion. Grab more pigment, put it down, work it out with a circular motion, and build on that subtle reflection of it. Should be darker than the top because reflections are, but it's looking pretty good. Now I think we're going to change our color just a little bit. We aren't going to need a lot of this new pigment, but it is Cerulean Blue, Mars Black, and Titanium White. We're looking for a darker version of our sky, just like that. Now we're just going to head into this bottom portion and render the darker portion of some of these clouds. I want to make it pretty watery, that way I can do a wet into dry blend, but we're just mirroring the top as we did before. And yet again, more water if it starts to get difficult to move around. There we go. From there, we're going to grab a substantial amount of our sap green and Mars Black with a hint of our Titanium White, and we'll start working on the reflection of all of our greenery. Now we'll begin by applying this mid value right underneath our previous application of the taller grass, and I'll work that all the way over until we meet the tall grass, which is more so in the foreground. And I'm going to apply this here as well, despite the fact that we're going to do the reflection of this in that same general area. And I'm going to do that with additional Mars Black. It's going to be just a little bit darker than our current mix, and that is going to be over top here. It's going to reflect this tree, so I'm just vertically going to use the brush to implement something quite similar. I'm going to use the corner of the brush to mimic these tapping motions as well, and this is all going to connect, of course, into that grassy area. Now, we're not quite done with mirroring our trees, so I'll bring that over there. We'll continue working our new mixture into the blend of this tall grass, and then we'll work in an X-shaped pattern for the most part to move out the rest of this mix, covering essentially the majority of our midground. There we go. Now we'll get quite a bit closer, and utilizing our smaller liner brush, we will reinstigate the tapped detail on both sides of our elongated tree reflections. So using that same hue, same value that we just used, it's a little bit darker than the one above, and this is essentially the mid value. We want something that can be a little bit darker, but we want something that can be brighter by quite a bit for the sake of the reflections of the shadows and the reflections of the highlights. I think we're working with a really good pigment for that. And there we go. By the way, if there's an area through here that isn't absolutely perfect, don't worry about it, because we are going to be able to go back in a little bit later and just cover things with various grass throughout the water. Now we'll return to that mix with some extra Mars Black in it, just to darken it up a bit for our shadows, and a hint of titanium white, not to brighten it, but to desaturate. Now we are going to apply the majority of this, as you would assume, with our fan brush, making those same vertical markings that we had on the edges of the tall grass. And that's a quick, easy start to getting the right patterns mirrored. However, we are going to quickly switch into that tapped application, which is initially vertical for our elongated trees, and then gets a bit more randomized as we work into the larger bodies of open space within the foliage. Remember, we're rotating our brush throughout this, but only in the air, not once the brush hits the canvas, because we don't want a lot of streaks. And then as we work over here towards the right and this middle section, it's much more of these more grand shadows. So the farther we get to this side, the more shadows there are, the more taps we create, the more close these taps are to one another. And values, they're not dramatically different right now, but they're different enough so that we do have that subtle variance. I like that. We can also reinterject some shadows into the top tall grass if you find the values are too different. And I think mine could definitely use that boost of contrast. There we go. Now we'll head back to the palette, and instead of rendering such a dark pigment, we'll render something a bit brighter with our sap green, our Naples yellow, bit of titanium white to desaturate it further, and a hint of our Mars Black mixed in as well. It's brighter, but it's not too bright. Now it's time to create more of a highlight for those reflections. So we'll grab some sap green, titanium white, Naples yellow. We'll begin to mix it a little bit into our Mars Black, because we don't want something too bright. We want something that has room for expansion of brightness and saturation. I think this is going to be great. So from there, we'll switch on over to our fan brush, grab a good amount of that pigment, and we can begin our reflections of our grass. Nice and easy. See that? Subtle. It's a little bit darker than that which we've previously rendered, but it's in spirit very much what we did above. And then we can grab more of it and do those taps predominantly around the edges that will be receiving light. So the left hand side of these. And much like the top, it's a fairly quick process. It's also your second time doing it, so you're probably quite a bit better at it, and will find success relatively quickly. There we go. Now we'll get closer, switch to our liner, go for an even brighter variant of that mix, and do things a bit more intentionally. So I'm going to head to the edge here. I'm going to look for the blades of grass which are more prominent up top, and I'll mirror those down here, just like so. A little bit more of that highlight towards the top, across the majority of it. And I see a notable grass strand there and there, one here, here. You can also paint them on the top and then paint them on the bottom for the sake of just ensuring that it all works really well together. I like that a lot. Now we'll head back into that bright mix. Pop on over here. Again, we have a good bright spot. I'm going to make it a bit softer using my hand. A little bit of finger painting. But we just want to match that top area as best we can. Oh, very happy. Very happy with how this is turning out. Good. Again, just giving the top of that grass reflection the attention it deserves. It's not going to be perfect, but water will have a little bit of movement, and that's okay. Then I'm just tapping in additional details for these spots as well. There we go. Now, it's not in the reference photo, but I do think I want some of my Naples yellow, titanium white, and burnt sienna in a brighter mix, which will cut across portions of the grass and the reflection. And you can see it's not a solid line. I'm trying to break it up here and there, and that's going to make it look like some of the grass is overlapping other portions. It's just going to make it a bit more three-dimensional. There we go. I love that. And it'll lessen as we get over here, but I think these applications as a whole will bleed really nicely into the sky. And we can do just hints of it work its way in through here as well, further making it look like water. Beautiful. Again, not too tricky either. Now, towards the bottom here, right around the boat, we are going to have a taller grass, much like this, but in the foreground, much more detailed, much more singular. So we're going to grab an abundance of our Mars black, a little bit of our sap green, titanium white. This is our darkest green yet, and our most saturated. So this is going to go initially right here. I am using the larger flat-headed brush because it is ideal for moving around a lot of paint with ease. We'll block in the remaining negative space to begin, and then we'll make our brush nice and damp. We'll grab more of that pigment and we'll start working our way upwards as if there are an abundance of clusters of grass in the foreground. We can also switch on over to our liner brush and accomplish something similar, but with real intent. So here, we're painting individual blades, just like so. We can have that working its way over through there. I'm painting it over the boat, but that's okay. We'll just paint the boat over the grass later on. Just a much easier way of layering and painting. And because our values are so similar, this won't be too dramatic of a visual. So I'm being a bit loose with it, but it is darker, it is more stark, and it gives the painting a nice vignette while contributing to a greater contrast around the boat and giving the viewer's eye something to really latch onto. So now I think we'll grab a bit more of that and we'll have some fun just applying individual strands out in the water. And these are going to overlap each other here and there. They're going to exist up high, back down low. We want a real diversity. And as we're doing it, we're always painting the counterpart reflection. There are a lot in the reference photo right through here, though I'd really recommend applying them wherever you don't love your reflections of the clouds. We're all going to have those areas that we like more than others, and that's okay. This gives us an opportunity to really play with it, make things nice and unique, but also make sure that the painting as a whole is something we really enjoy. Lots of these little markings. Going in with as little pressure as possible so that we get the softest marking possible. And we can use various greens as well. Now from there, we can get a bit closer just so you can really see the detail work here. We do one line on top, one line on bottom, one line on top, one line on bottom, and they get smaller as we move upwards because, you know, perspective is making them look a lot farther away. I might also, when I make the stroke, make the bottom portion blend it out and downwards so that it has a bit of lost in the water, because you don't want the reflection to always be as opaque as the top portion. So we have a very opaque top and then a bit of a dragged, less opaque bottom. I'm also trying to create a bit of a leading line this way, and then it breaks off and expands in more unique ways. But here I think something I need to do is just work on overlapping more of these, because that'll add to the realism pretty dramatically. I'm also going to go over previous tops of them, make sure they're nice and opaque so that they stand out from the reflected bottoms. There we go. Now we're going to mix up a mid-value green using our sap green, titanium white, and a little bit of Mars black. We don't want this to be too bright as it is in shadow, but we do want it to be brighter than our shadow. Then we'll switch back to the liner for some foreground larger grass. So from there, we're going to lean into the darker markings that we've already made. You can see little impressions that protrude upwards. I'm trying to follow those for the most part, and just on the top I let the pigment run out and I relieve pressure as we work our way downwards, because the top will have light, the bottom will not. We'll also start overlapping these and ensure that we have something that progressively loses light towards the bottom and even away from this larger opening of light, right? Because this area is going to have a lot more than this area. And we do still want those markings in that area, but we want less of them, and we want them to be a little bit less opaque. It's also worth noting that these markings are going to be a lot taller than the ones in the background. We do want to imply that this grass is quite big, the boat has moved up upon it, and it is still taller than a lot of that boat. So these are much more elongated. You can see that I'm really taking my brush from one end to another, some of which protruding pretty dramatically. And I'm also switching the way in which the brush stroke moves, so it's not always down and towards the left. Sometimes it's down towards the right. And that variance is going to be important for keeping it looking still and calm. It's one of those things where if we put all of the grass moving in the same direction, it would look quite windy, as if the wind is pushing it all to be similar. But if we have it go the other direction, then the grass is simply fairly still, and it's a much more calm feeling day. So you can have it all in the same direction, but it does dictate the wind, and the wind does dictate the feeling of the painting. So different things to be aware and cognizant of through the painting process. Also, again, as you move farther down, I do less strokes. I let them be less opaque, just like so. For a boat, we're going to start with some shadows, and that includes a cerulean blue, good amount of our Mars black, titanium white to desaturate it, but this will look great with the sky and the water. Now we're going to head into the inside of the boat, and with this larger sharp brush, I'm going to craft the outline of the top. I'll craft a line to note this wall of the boat, and then I'll also craft lines around the protruding seating areas within the boat. So it's a lot of line work. I'll also carve out a space right before the floor, as seen here. And then we'll start to fill in that negative space through fairly intentional marking. Just like that. Now we'll head to the inside of the back of the boat and do the same thing. We're carving along the top, we're carving along the protruded seat, we're applying right in front of this side, and we're just doing a nice thick layer. Now we're just going to make it a little bit darker so we can incorporate some shadow, depth, and gradient into that application. So from here, we're just going to apply it towards the bottoms of those last applications, and we'll do a soft blend upwards. That way we have a transition from this darker hue into something just a little bit brighter. It shows that there's more shadow towards the bottom, follows a similar rule set as the grass. Doesn't have to be dramatic, just needs to create a slight variance. We can also correct different angles and whatnot through this process, which is fun. Now we're just going back with the brighter pigment for a little bit of a mixing, keeping it nice wet on wet. Now we're going to make it even darker for the floor, so a little bit more of the Mars black and the cerulean blue. The application here, fairly simple. We're going to apply it to the two open spots of the floor here in our boat. It's slightly darker than anything we have, but only slightly. We're working with a lot of similar values and hues. That's okay, it'll feel quite cohesive. There we go. We also don't want to blend, we want it to be a rather sharp line. We can also use this with a little bit of extra Mars black for the sides of our seats to be. And there's just 2 of those, which we're crafting with that same brush, though you could switch to the smaller flat-headed brush if you wanted to. We'll work on the tops of the seats, which do protrude and catch quite a bit of light. So we're going for a bit of a brighter blue mix here with the smallest hint of our burnt sienna to make it a bit earthy and a little bit warmer. A little bit darker. And there we go. Now, this application is going to be cathartic in that we're filling in the remainder of the inside of the boat's open space, though we will be coming back to this with a truly warm highlight, a lot more of our burnt sienna, maybe a little bit of our cad yellow, cad red, to show some real light on these portions. But this is a great start, and I do think it makes the inside of the boat much more visually distinct. So we'll just continue to cut along the edges, make sure we know where we want the majority of that pigment, then we can head inside, apply real pressure, make that look quite good. Also, if you want a greater gradient along the top, we can interject just a little bit of it towards that top and then have it blended down softly. That'll make the steps, the seats, look a lot more cohesive. This also won't be as bright as what we have here because the darker pigment will show through underneath it, but it'll look good. Now I'm going to remix the darker color that we used for the floor as well as the darker but slightly lighter color that we used for the boat's inner walls. And we'll use both of these for the outer wall. Now, moving into this area, I'm going to take the lighter of the 2 mixes and I'm going to place that, as you can see, around the top of the boat, almost meeting our previous applications of paint, but not quite. I'm trying to leave a little bit of it brighter for the sake of marking the space and knowing where I'm going back to. And then we'll bring it down to about the halfway point, if not slightly lower. This will just give us a good area to blend with. Keeping that edge nice and sharp. Now we'll go in with the darker pigment towards the very bottom of the boat, which is also still sketched in, so not difficult to find. I'll work a good line for that, and then much like the other pigment, I will work my way vertically. This time it's up rather than down, but this will meet that last pigment in the middle. Both are still wet, so with a now damp brush, I should be able to just blend the 2 fairly softly into each other and render something with a good gradient from dark to light. The bottom doesn't have to be perfect as we will have grass overlapping it, but I do like this a lot. Now from there, I'm going to take that same flat-headed brush and a very similar pigment to what I used for the seating, and I'm going to paint the upper lip of the boat. This is a great area because it's going to adopt a lot of light and be dramatically brighter. That said, as you can see here, there's a spot in between the grass and the boat which is still orange, and I'm purposefully leaving it so. I think we need to bring the grass downwards. It's one of those things where we could build the lip of the boat to be taller, but I think it'll just look better with a thinner lip. So we'll work in the other direction once we start working on our grass again. And now I'll just take care of the remainder of the orange along these edges. There we go. Almost time for highlights. Don't forget to do multiple layers. We do want this relatively thick. Now we're going to re-grab our cadmium yellow and our cadmium red because we're going back into some warmer sunny highlights. Before we mix our color, I thought I'd note we probably want something in this palette or what we have right here. That way the middle of the painting, the top of the painting, is cohesive with the bottom. So to achieve this color, we're going to grab some titanium white, Naples yellow, a little bit of our cad yellow, a little bit of our cad red, and we'll do a healthy mix. As you can see, I think I need a bit more yellow to make it an orangey hue. And just like that, we find what we're looking for. Now, as for our actual application, we're going to head towards the top edges of the boat, as they're going to receive the most amount of light. And this is something that can be accomplished, as you can see, with the larger flat-headed brush. I am just working my way around the edge. However, we can also put that down, pick up yet again our smaller flat-headed brush for just a little bit more control in the setting. And that's actually just letting me work faster. So it's interesting in that we can't cover as much space, but because we have additional control, we don't have to be apprehensive with every brush stroke. And it's also worth noting that we are working with acrylics. And what does that mean? It means we need to do multiple layers. So this first one is going to look a little rough, and that's okay. We accept that as we go in. Also, as things start to dry, we go back. We clean up, we make lines straighter, we make applications more opaque. Also, not every area of the edge has to receive the same amount of reflective light. Some are going to be more opaque than others, and that is a-okay. I'll re-grab some of the blue that we used for around the lip, and I'll apply that towards the right-hand side of the boat, have it progressively work towards the left and blend into the wet highlight. And we're doing this because this area is going to be brighter, but it's still going to be cast in shadow, so it'll be a brighter blue, which will eventually find this beautiful warmth, and they will combine to make something a bit more unique. So it's not just highlight and cool blues, it's a combination of the two, which will make this subject that which it is. Double down on this. There we go. Now we'll head into these three, and we'll do so with the liner brush to give us the absolute greatest control. I'm going to apply it initially, as you can see, towards the area of the boat that is most open. This area is cast in shadow from this wall, but the left-hand side of these, the area that's closest to us, should be a little bit brighter. So I'll apply this there first with a wet into dry application. Everything on the canvas is fully dry, but the pigment I apply is very watery. So we get this smooth transition for the most part. Occasionally we can see a bit of tooth in the application on the brush, but that's okay, because we are working on wood, and if it has that granular look, it's actually just great for the subject itself. There we go. Now we'll go in yet again, build up those highlights, and as you can see in the next couple of layers, I'm going to be working in the same direction as the boards. That way the brush strokes that show through look like movements within the wood, and it just adds this extra detail, extra texture that looks really, really nice with the painting. The blue in between these applications also works great because it looks like shadows in between highlighted portion. There we go. Now we're going to let those highlights dry, and in the meantime we're going to add a reflection of the boat. So I'll grab a little bit of cerulean blue, Mars black, titanium white, and the goal here is to render something less dark than the side of the boat, but still darker than the water. Something in between. We'll go ahead and give this a try. And immediately I can tell that's the color of the water. So we need it a little bit darker. Maybe we'll make it slightly more saturated because it's so close to us. That means more cerulean blue. Go in yet again. And this would be a great reflection color. I'm just going to drag this down, as you can see, cutting our boat into the water. We'll make it nice and smooth because it is a reflection in fairly unwavering water. And towards the bottom there, I'll just make my brush nice and damp. And if we want, we can even cut along like that, down and in. Nice and smooth. Now we'll remix a green for the darker base of the next set of grasses. So sap green, titanium white, Mars black, we want it to be quite dark and rich because we are on the foreground, so a lot of saturation with that sap green and Mars black. And with this pigment, we are going to have a lot of fun filling in the remainder of our blank space on the canvas. This will be a lot of tall grass. We'll work it all the way out here, just like so. You can see just a hint of that water at the bottom, but we won't for long because after we just clean up this top area, like so, we'll create some darker protrusions from the bottom. That means strands in abundance that work their way upwards, similarly to this. Though, once we have the majority of the larger movements that connect the base, as you can see like this, we're going to switch on over to our liner brush because it will be able to handle detail in a much more elegant way. So we'll just build a couple protrusions, enough that we no longer have a hard line towards the bottom here. And then we'll switch our brush. We've switched over to our liner, and we can continue from the tops of the previously instilled strands while also incorporating brand new ones. So we'll grab more pigment, we'll overlap greater portions of our boat. This is all just going to create a lot of depth, make it a lot more interesting, unique. Now it really feels like it's sitting in this harbor of greenery. Little ones that cross over are also great. Now we'll just move over here towards the left-hand side of this foliage. And you can see I'm going in so lightly that sometimes I don't even make contact with the canvas, just because I want to apply as little pressure as possible. And that means sometimes I don't get close enough to the canvas with each stroke. But that's fine. It's not a bad thing. It shows that we're cautious and careful. Okay, now I know we have all of the canvas officially covered. However, we're far from finished. We have a lot of details that are going to make this significantly better. Now I'm also going to use that same darker pigment we had to extend this tree downwards a little bit and have it protrude over this grass. That's just going to give us a subject that exists top to bottom in the painting and connects multiple layers of depth and foliage. Lots of rotation, lots of protrusions. And from there, we'll mix a nice mid-value green, grabbing a hint of the darker green, our titanium white, and this on top of a darker pigment will look like a mid-value. The actual application process will be applied with our liner brush. You can see I'm doubling down on some of the markings that we had in this grass. It's one of those things where we made these with a lot of water, so they're fairly transparent and they just need that extra boost, that extra application. So once we have the ones done that are closest to the edge, that will be receiving the most amount of light, we're going to switch things up a little bit and we'll start heading down here. Now with these, we want to be quite intentional and get the side of the grass which is facing the light. It means one side of the grass might be a little bit darker. I'll create some depth. We're going a bit slower with these until we have the primary ones done. So I'll grab some extra water, some extra pigment, head back in. Remember, this isn't a highlight, it's a mid-value. So we don't want it to be too prominent, but I think that's pretty good. And just for example, you can see how little paint I'm picking up with my brush. Incredibly minuscule, that way it doesn't leave a larger marking on the canvas. So yet again, we head in. We create contrast. All of a sudden these start to stand out in a more unique way, but also feel cohesive within the painting. We have a more saturated, prominent green than we've had elsewhere. Typically it's more grayed. And that's natural with getting closer and closer to us as our closer subjects have more of their innate hues. Less disrupted and muddied by the colors of the atmosphere. These are also nice because they stand out against the darker blues of the boat. Now we have a lot of negative space down here. We're going to start filling it with additional grass which crisscrosses and renders additional depth. The first applications here were very intentional and slow because we were trying to mimic previously applied grass, but this is a portion where we can be much more free-flowing and just playful in our movements. So we're kind of rewarded for the vigilance of past application. You can see I'm really jumping around. That's intentional, just so we have real variance in our types of grass and clusters. Now, once this is fully dry to the touch, as mine is, I'm going to grab that same green and we'll go in with a litany of taps towards the left-hand side that's closer to the light. We'll let it progressively run out as we run towards the right-hand side. Our taps get more spacious as we get towards that right-hand side. And we're just continuing to build a different texture and similar hues on top of our taller grass. So it all works together, but it adds nice variance. We also don't have too much to do here, so just like that, we are pretty much done. We'll let it dry so we can add some highlights, and then it'll look really nice. Now from there, we need a highlight for our grass. I'm starting by mixing a heavy orange, which will dilute with titanium white and Naples yellow. A lot of Naples yellow and titanium white. A lot of burnt sienna. Should be a brilliant, warm, earthy mix. And yet again, doubling down on brightening this up. We can also try, you don't have to, but you can try interjecting a little bit of our sap green in part of the mix, and that's just a nice in-between to grab, should you want it. So now we'll get closer, we'll grab our liner, and we'll use this highlight on just the tops of the blades of grass, which are closest to the light. We'll have them dissipate as you move towards the right-hand side and back, similar to the regular highlights. However, these are just much more unique in hue. You can see it stands out against the reflections in a really beautiful way. It's akin to the highlights on the boat. And we'll move around, continue to deliver this to the tops of previously applied blades of grass. Again, works beautifully over the darker values that are pre-existing. We can also render brand new blades to work in conjunction with those of old. These are much more out in the light, so they can have a more dramatic mix and application. Really just glowing. Now, on all of these individual ones, which find themselves in the middle of our lake, we'll go back and we'll just adorn them with a little bit of light as well. Not much, just a little bit. Alright, now we can make things really pop with some highlights. For set highlights, we're going to add a little bit of Naples yellow to our mix, hint of titanium white, and maybe just a little bit of our cad yellow as well. With said highlight, we're going to go to the tops of those blades of grass we just highlighted, and we're going to continue those more extravagant portions, really just doubling down on that which we've accomplished, but sometimes we extend a little bit and we are leaving that last application in there as well. This is really just an addition to sit on top of it. But by having all of these different hues and values, we make the piece much more complex and interesting. Now we'll use our fan brush with that highlight to tap those beautiful pigments on top here, right under the light. We're not doing a drag because it's so far away. And I'm doing a lot more of these taps in the central area, and I'll have them dissipate as you move down, but also to the left and right. Let's move a little bit to the right now, and we'll do some of this just on the edge, because the edge will catch more light than the rest. And yet again, we let it dissipate as we move that way. We can also do a couple strokes though. That's probably best saved for our liner brush. Just a couple highlights. Now, because we did that bottom area, we also need to deliver a couple highlights to this top foliage, and I don't want to do too much because we do want this area to be somewhat silhouetted, create that harsh contrast for great depth, but we do still need to put it on the sides of the trees which are receiving light, best achieved with our liner brush, as you can see, and we can bring that slightly over towards the right hand side, just climbing these trees, bringing it back down, adding just enough that it feels nice and natural. Should also blend in with the sky, which will be a good cohesive blend and movement between both of our pigments. So it also gives us a chance to kind of open up portions of this as well if we happen to do just a little bit too much of our greenery initially. Now we're just jumping around our trees, doing a little bit by little bit. You can see there's almost no pigment left on my brush, just because we are farther and farther away from that light, and I want there to be just an implied impression of light. Now we'll head back into this bush with slightly brighter mix, very much akin to the color of the sun, and we'll just open up the foliage a little bit more, and this will all make it feel incredibly bright, like it's just breaking through, delivering something beautiful, warm, relaxed. Doing slight blends around some of the edges so it looks diffused. There we go. Now we'll head back to the horizon line, which, as you can see, is a little transparent, not as bright post drying. So I'll just re-interject that highlight through there, brighten it up a little bit, and make it really feel like a glow. Now we'll take a brief break from that top area, give us some time to digest how we feel about it, and add some real highlights to these bottom protrusions. Same rule applies in that we're extending our grass just a little bit. We're bringing it down into the past highlight, but we're not covering all of the past highlight. We're just covering a portion of it. It's a slight glimmer, not the entirety of the blade of grass. We'll do some that are a little bit farther down. And now heading back into here. This area is quite important as it is where the boat is. It is where we want the viewer's eye for the most part. So we're going to put extra attention into building this up. And we're just going to go back for some water. It's important, it's imperative, we keep our brush nice and sharp for these applications, as this is really how we render that realism, make it feel complete, full. Lots of crisscrossing. Oh, that's a nice one. We didn't really have any highlights over to that right hand side, but they should exist. There we go. Love that. And we can do a couple over here for the sake of cohesion, wanting to bring that area into this area. Now we have this tree, which really protrudes out. So a lot of the edging of it should have at least a little bit of this warmer hue. And now we're also again making everything really feel like it fits together. I'm not going to do so much towards the absolute bottom of it, but I might move up a little bit for the sake of getting these areas which are really open and exposed to more light. Nothing's casting a shadow on them. They are just right and ready to be warm and beautiful, especially in contrast with this big cloud. They'll stand out wonderfully. There's this portion in the middle where it kind of connects, color-wise. The highlights of the sun, but then towards the very top, it's just a playground for highlight. Now this is what we've been working with. I'm going to grab some titanium white, add it to that mix. I'm also going to grab a little bit of burnt sienna, render something even brighter than that which we've been using, and we'll head back to the canvas for some details. So I'm going to go in, not with lines, but with little taps, little highlights. It's one of those things where it could look like the tops of foliage catching light. It could look like little fireflies or something in the air, but it's going to be this really unique bonus detail which makes things feel light and airy and dreamy and all of the fun things. We'll bring it down into here, just with the occasional little tap, and it'll really stand out because it's so dark. And now we'll do the same just over the boat. Again, not lines, but taps. Maybe it's a little bit of a tap and drag, but for the most part it's this very relaxed application. Not much intentionality behind it. We're just trying to find open areas that could use a little speckle of light. I'm doing it in the grass, above the grass. And it's just making it a lot more interesting. So we just did a lot of detail in the bottom, a lot of highlights, and because of that, now we have more room for detail and highlights in the clouds and the sky. So we're going to head up there. Initially, I was hesitant to do it because I didn't want to overdo it and then make it so that we had to do too much in the bottom, but it's one of those things where now that we've kind of figured out the bottom, we can go back and do more in the clouds in the way that I really hoped we could. Now we'll recreate a highlight color for our clouds, something very much akin to what we initially had, which, as you can probably remember, was the same colors we have been using, but greater emphasis on the Naples yellow and titanium white. Now take that beautiful pigment and we'll do little tests by filling in the centers of a lot of these clouds, just making sure they're nice and opaque, that's cohesive with the cloud as a whole, and then we can start working our way out. I really like these designs that we have, but I also want them to be a bit softer, so I do a little painting and I do a little finger painting. I do a little painting and then I do a little finger painting, and that's just going to expand things in a fairly natural way. Love that. Thought about doing this at the very beginning of the painting, but I didn't want to overdo the details, and we waited, and now I can do it with the assurance that it's just the right amount. I have a much more complex cloud system and sky. I have some wispy clouds behind. Love that. So now we'll take a step back and we'll do some final details using our Mars Black, Sap Green, little bit of our burnt sienna, a little bit of our Naples yellow. This would be a good color for additional little pieces of grass out in the water. And as we do this, I would like to say a big thank you to all of you for being here today, for taking the time, for joining me on this artistic endeavor. Love painting these landscapes, love painting sunsets, love painting water, reflections, all of it. I think we typically don't do kind of human-made structures like boats and things like that, but it makes it, so when we do, a bit more special. And I think this one turned out great. Also, as per usual, I want to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon supporting the channel, making lessons like this happen. Truly would not be able to do it if it weren't for you and your support. Thank you for the patronage. Thank you for just being so supportive of the arts. And if you're new here, this is your first lesson and you're unaware, up over on Patreon you can get the ad-free version of this video. You can get the ad-free version of other brand new videos. We have exclusive bonus lessons up there, over 100 of them, and big 24 by 24 inch series, 24 by 26 inch series. So if you typically like to work on bigger canvases, that's where we do that kind of thing. It's in multi-parts, so you have like a 20-hour long series on an individual painting, and we can really dive into the details. You can also get all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first. You can also get access to our exclusive Facebook group, where different members of our community are wonderful and supportive and incredibly talented and inspiring. I feel like when I go on there, I always see different iterations of these, and I think to myself, oh, I want to go back and work on that painting again and add this subject or work on that subject. I feel like I'm always inspired by what I see in there, but it's a great place to share your artwork with other members of the community. Pop in when I can, when I have time, but I feel like there's a lot of just great advice and support in there anyway. Great community. Very proud of it. Very proud of all of you for being here. Towards the end of these videos, typically on average, 13% of people are still watching. So if you're here, that means you're part of the 13 very dedicated percent. And I think that's a good sign that you're going to do fantastic things with your artwork in general. If you can sit through a 2.5-hour video learning and just kind of relaxing with me, then I think you're probably the type of person who's going to be pretty meticulous with your painting and make it turn into something special. So I wish you so much success with that. I wish you inspiration. I wish you wonderful afternoons and mornings painting. I did this one in the morning, in the afternoon. I did an all-nighter, just kind of painting through the night because it was too hard to put that brush down. And I hope that, again, you find inspiration in all of those same ways, because it's wonderful when the art just kind of guides you through life. And very much feel like this one did that for me. Love these scenes. And I already know what we're doing next week. So if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because there will be a brand new painting lesson coming Saturday. And I think that you really like it too. With that, thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you'd like to work with the exact same brushes as I do, there will be a link in the description for my 5-piece brush set. I do all of my lessons with it, and I've been using the same brushes for about 2 years now, so they're holding up well. That said, I always have a hard time signing off on these videos, but I do know I need to, because we need to finish the video and upload it for you. So thank you for being here. Thank you to my wonderful partner, Athena, for filming this incredible video. We tried something new today. I think it worked wonderfully, and I'm excited to bring you a lot more painting lessons in the very near future. With that said, I'll see you soon, and above all, as always, stay creative.